Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and I'm joined again today by Dave Johnson. Dave was the pastor of Church of the Open Door in Minneapolis for 38 years, and now he's the director of Things That Remain, a ministry to pastors and church leaders. So, hey, Dave, thanks for being here.
Hey, it's good to be here again.
Yeah,
I'm enjoying this very much. It's kind of cool. Yeah,
I am too. So we're continuing on with our talks about this book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that's threatening our democracy. And we're talking about chapter 2 today. But this book is about the new Apostolic Reformation. And that might sound like kind of a benign enough sort of a name, but the group is anything but benign. The book takes a disturbing look into this group of self-appointed prophets and apostles who played a large role in winning over Christian support for Donald Trump the first time that he ran. And then they played a key role in the Christian presence at the January 6th insurrection. And now they've come back into prominence because in recent weeks, Trump has started his second term, and so they have his ear. So this is a sort of book that I wish I could get some of my friends and my family to read, because I've got a lot of friends and family who are, Christians who voted for Trump, but they're not this kind of Christian that we see in the book here. In my experience, my Christian family and friends care about a couple of social issues that have led them to the Republican Party in the past. And that was my own story, actually, until 2016, when the Republicans tried to give me Donald Trump. And that ended up breaking me forever in regard to the Republican Party. So I wish that my sort of what I would call like normie Christian friends and family would read this book, or that they'd read Tim Alberta's book that Dave and I talked about last year, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, and maybe realize that these aren't my people. They don't care about the things that I care about. Why am I letting these people represent me politically? So the book is written by Matthew.
And you mean by that, you mean some of these people in the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation. Yes.
Yeah, it's like, I think you and I both have all kinds of friends and family members who are just like, if they knew what was behind a lot of these, the Christianese that they end up hearing out of some of the Christian leaders and stuff.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, wait, they've got a completely different agenda than what I voted for.
And I think a very different version of Christianity as well.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I don't want to totally get you. I don't want to.
No, that's fine.
Because I like what you're saying here, but
yeah.
I think that part of it is, and I don't mean to call people, they're not stupid at all.
Right.
But we're busy, and we get into a bubble, and I think there's just been a lot of people, friends of mine even, who just aren't that informed about what's really going on the ground. What are some of the dynamic and motivating factors that are manifesting in things like the insurrection? Well, what is that anyway?
Right. Yeah,
this
I think what
book was stunning relative to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about there reminds me of when I was in seminary many years ago, and I was talking with a professor who was talking about Christian ethics. This might have even been an undergraduate, but he asked the question about a stop sign. He said, are we making a moral decision when we stop at a stop sign or not? He was laying out these different levels of moral decisions. And I was the one in the class that said, yes, we are. And he was like, really? Would you call that a moral decision? And what I said was, it is. It's just that it's a no-brainer. We decided at some point in our life, way back, I'm going to be the type of person who obeys stop signs. And so now we go and we see these stop signs, and we just go through life having made that decision way back then. And I think a lot of our political beliefs are the same way, where we make these decisions about who we align with politically, and it might be some very moral process that went into those decisions, but now we're riding on it as a no-brainer. And so when like you and I come along and we're trying to talk to people, we're trying to kind of say, okay, I get why you made that decision. In my case, back in the 80s as a young guy, to be, a member of like that, the religious right. And we're trying to say things have changed, whether that was a good decision back then or not. Right now, the people you're supporting are very different from the ones you chose to support back then. It's not a no-brainer.
I'd like to add some of that personally.
Yeah.
Because that was my experience on two levels, both with evangelicals, which I am an evangelical. I'm an evangelical pastor for 42 years of my adult life. And the Republican Party. I've been a Republican all my life, just like you, Pat. And I grew up in that weird cultural bubble that couldn't conceive of a Christian voting any other way than Republican. That was kind of a synonymous thing. And I remember the 2016 election when I heard that 81% of white evangelicals had voted for someone who had no character, and we always cared about character. I'm going, what in the world? What happened to my tribe? Huge, a big what? Like I've been in this and felt comfortable as an evangelical, and I'm not sure I do anymore. But the other was the shift in the Republican Party. It is not your grandpa's Oldsmobile. I mean, it's not. It's a different deal. It has morphed.
Yeah.
And so I do think I would encourage everyone, and I don't care who you vote for, but it might be time to rethink some of those stop signs.
Right. But us coming along is like, I know that people hear it, and judging by the comments that I get on my YouTube channel, it's as though I'm telling them, you don't need to think about stop signs anymore. You're dumb for stopping at a stop sign. You should just blow right through, and it's like, that's how they first hear it. It takes a lot of unpacking to get at, like, why did I make this major shift?
Yeah.
And anyway, so that's why
you can explain to them, and I can help you with this. It's a metaphor.
Yeah. So anyway, so the book that we're talking about, The Violent Take It by Force, is written by Matthew Taylor. And just a heads up, this is kind of exciting. Matthew Taylor is going to come on this podcast in late March, and about a month from now, once Dave and I have worked through the book together, and he's offered to answer questions from our listeners. So if you have questions for Matt Taylor, you can leave them in the comments, and then we'll go through all the comments beforehand, and we'll pull out some questions for him for when he's here. So, so let's jump into this. So,
can I just say one thing now that I know that Matthew Taylor has watched these?
Yeah.
He's an unbelievable guy. He's just a great... And actually,
right. Yep.
I do like this. He's a good writer.
It's a great book. Yep. Yeah. Neither of us knew him before this, but it's a great book. Yeah. So today we're covering chapter 2, and this is about C. Peter Wagner, who founded the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. And Dave and I both have experience with Wagner from afar. We didn't know him personally. You didn't know him, right? Yeah.
I've been in, I've heard him. I've been in the room with him, but
right. But so we're going to talk about that. But here's where I think we're going to go today. We're going to talk first about the journey that Peter Wagner went on that led him from being a missionary to a respected seminary professor to the architect, finally, of one of the most dangerous Christian movements in America. And along the way, we're going to meet a few of the characters who are going to play a larger role later in the book. And we're also going to talk about who the NAR is, the New Apostolic Reformation, what makes them the New Apostolic Reformation. There's 3 legs of the NAR stool that Taylor writes about. And so we're going to talk about those 3 core principles, including sort of dominion theology, which is going to show up a lot later on in the book. But we're going to get into that a little bit today. And then we're going to go into one of the biggest examples of the exploitation and abuse that I think this structure of the NAR allows for. So in the Lakeland Revival, we're going to be talking about that. So, but in my view, the scandals surrounding the revival, the Lakeland Revival, are just a microcosm of the danger that NAR prophets and apostles pose to the nation as a whole, now that these are the people who have the ear of the President of the United States. And what I would say before I get Dave going here is just, in my view, the core issue, all of this comes down to the issue of authority. So we talked a lot in the past couple of weeks about how this is a charismatic movement. And Dave gave some really good background on his own experience in the charismatic movement. And we're not coming against the charismatic movement or the charismatic gifts. That's not what it's about. The core issue to my mind is the abuse of authority and the way that supposed prophetic gifts are used to claim unquestioned authority for a lot of really misled, and I would say in some cases very depraved people. So they have these gifts that they demonstrate, whether they're real or not. I won't make a judgment on all of them, but I will make a judgment that all of them are using those gifts to put themselves in a place of authority that then is getting abused. And that's to me the central issue. So I've always seen the abuse of authority as a problem within the church when I was in it. But after I retired, I started to make the connection to authoritarianism outside the church as well. And what I've come to see is that on some level, authoritarianism is built into some of the strands of Christianity, and some approaches to theology actually feed into some really dangerous authoritarian political movements. And so this book is giving us a deep look into one version of how that authoritarian impulse can take over a Christian movement, and how it can lay the groundwork for some, what I've said, obvious charlatans like Paula White last week and Donald Trump to take advantage of people of faith. So all that is introduction for you.
Yeah,
Dave.
I think it's great, Pat. But I just want to just poke around at that authority, because I agree with you that authority thing. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a book on spiritual abuse, the subtle power of spiritual abuse. I think we talked about it in the last session.
Yeah, and I linked to that in the comments of all of these.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that you'll see when you have these authoritarian dynamics, whether it's a secular one or in the church, there's hierarchy, and it's like, and on one level it just looks okay and maybe even biblical at some level, but but you have, I mean, the one we're most familiar with is patriarchy, where you have men over women. You have and the husband and wife over their children. What's really bad about hierarchy, you also have in some quarters white people over black people or any other race. But the way it fits here is that if you are identified as an apostle or a prophet, what comes with that is ex cathedra. Ex cathedra is when the Pope speaks, he speaks ex cathedra. It's with authority. It's like
from the throne. Yeah,
and there's no and people who push back on that won't last very long, or they'll get kind of pounded on to line up again. Or I don't want to be weird, but there are people who will just go along. They like being told to be certain, and I think that's the positive thing. Not the positive thing, but the attraction of the authoritarian thing is I don't have to think. I'm just going to listen to him. He knows, or she knows. And that, anyway, that's kind of the way I see that working.
Yep. And we see it in churches, and then we see it in politics. And one of the ways it plays out is, again, like yesterday, I saw another comment. I get comments every day. I don't see most of them because I've been on the road most of the time, but I glance at my comments. And yesterday I had another one where a guy was saying, how dare you say the things that you're saying? Don't you know that God has put Donald Trump in his position? How dare you challenge him? I see this kind of comment all the time, and I almost never respond. Although the one yesterday I did respond because I was tired, and I said, don't you know that God put me in charge of this channel? How dare you question the content that I choose to put on this? But anyway, why don't you get into this? C. Peter Wagner. Why don't you just, this is what the chapter is all about, is how Wagner was the architect of the NAR. So we'll talk about his life, and we'll talk about what led him to found this movement, and what I think are some really key broken pieces of the movement.
Yeah.
We'll get into that later on. So,
Well, I want to get. I'll give you mine, and then I want to hear your take too, because I know you have some experience with at least some of his thinking and stuff
around
like that.
missiology, yeah.
It's another thing I really like about Taylor's book is that he does this thing where he will zoom in really close to a person, like last chapter was Paul White, and then he'll zoom back out and help us get a much bigger picture, and it usually involves going back because this all came from some place.
Yeah.
And I think that really is part of understanding Peter Wagner, because 25 years ago, or whenever it was, early 80s. I think he was at Fuller Seminary in the late 70s or something like that.
Yeah, something like
when
that.
I was just entering ministry, I got to Open Door at 2080. So I was, or 2080. Anyway, 1980. And so my seminary experience was clearly before that. But in seminary, Peter Wagner was kind of the guy. He was the church growth guru. I didn't know his roots. And because the book kind of, Taylor talked about the fact that he basically was a missionary. I love the story of him coming to faith because he loved this girl named Doris who became his wife. And sure, I'll accept Jesus. And it wasn't quite like that. It was a little more authentic than that. And I'll go to the mission field if I can, be with you, blah, blah, blah. And so there's something very innocent, actually, I think, about Wagner. I don't agree with some of his stuff, but I just think, especially at the beginning, there was an innocence, missions, and he was...
Can I just say to that, Dave?
Yes.
Just because it might not come up later. What I see is there is an innocence about him all through his life. It's got a dark piece of it, which I would call naivete, where I think some of these people who used him later in life, this is how I see it, that they saw him coming a mile away and said, well, here's a guy who's going to create a structure that allows me to advance myself in his structure. And I think he was super naive about how people were using him. But that's my take.
That could have been the issue, naivete. I think also he got caught up in there's something very interesting about Wagner. Let me just back up. So he's basically a seminary professor, Fuller Seminary, and I'm going to use the word cessationist. And a cessationist is someone who doesn't believe in the gifts, very conservative theologically. And that was what I was back in those days. But one of the things about Peter Wagner that I really like, and I think it got him in trouble, is that he is kind of I see him, he's very professorial. He's got this little beard and he's gray and he looks kind of nerdy, to tell you the truth. There's nothing radical or scary about him. He's not ever going to be screaming in the pulpit or anything like that. But he's just very open to whatever it takes. And let me just put the best possible spin on it that will promote the kingdom of God and get people to come to faith in Christ. I just want to do anything, everything we can. And so he was very innovative. His church growth stuff, he had taken social science and wondered about people groups. That was one of the things that offended you about his homogeneous thing. We'll get to that in a second. But so part of what set him up for being used, as you said, but I also think it was part of something I like about him. I like being around people like him. He's willing to change. He can pivot. He's not going to be stuck with this thing because we did it. We can't do it any different way. I remember going into when I first started ministry, there was a phrase going around, the 7 last words of a dying church. We never did it that way before. So Peter Wagner would blow that kind of stuff up. And yes, and you can imagine guys like you and me in our youth going, nostrils are flaring. Yeah, baby. And I really like that about him. And so his professorial, missional strategy to do church growth, you always talk, I remember talk about here's how to break the 200 barrier. And he kind of talked about the levers to pull. I was never interested in it, but he wasn't a bad guy. I just didn't care about that. It felt too strategized, to tell you the truth. I think a big pivot for him, a big one, was meeting John Wimber. I don't know if you want to respond to what I just said, but John Wimber was a major. It was the next step in his going, whoa, there's more than what I thought. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I do think that's right. I'm going to say this right now. I was going to say it at the end, but I'm going to say it right now because I'll forget to say it at the end. That the frame that I use, and you can respond to this if you think that this is correct or not. The frame that I use about Peter Wagner is that he's described in the book as a pragmatist. He's trying to figure out how to grow the kingdom of God. So he's a church growth guy, and so the example, like you mentioned, that I didn't like, that I had to read in 2 or 3 different classes at seminary, was about his homogeneous unit principle, where it's like birds of a feather flock together, and you want to build a church by just, don't try to make people mix across racial lines or whatever, because they're not comfortable. Just, it's going to be a lot more effective if you're all together. And in his mind, it wasn't nearly as bad as that sounds, the way that I describe it. He didn't mean it in a racial kind of a racist kind of a way, but it's hard not to go in that way when you hear.
He gave us all permission to not care about having congregations that are mixed race. It's like, and then we end up with white megachurches.
Right. So then, so Rick Warren was like, so Rick Warren was like a disciple of his in some ways before the NAR type, but just the church growth thing. So when, like, I read like The Purpose Driven Church by Rick Warren when I was in seminary, and they were talking about figure out who, your primary audience is. And he was in the Saddleback Valley in California. So it was Saddleback Sally and Saddleback Sam or whatever. And you build this idea of this is what they look like, and I'm going to go after this specific person and target my message.
Did the same thing.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's a lot of what you see
in or something like that.
Yeah. So a lot of what you see in the megachurch movement is based on that, and it does work. It does work. So that's the pragmatic thing that Wagner brought in. But what I want to say, the frame that I'm putting around it, is that what you're going to be talking about in a minute, where he met John Wimber and ended up embracing the spiritual gifts, the charismatic gifts, and prophecy and the miraculous and all of that. To my view, what never changed right up to the end of Peter Wagner's life is that he was a pragmatist, and he was using worldly methods to build the kingdom of God. And I would say that his use of the miraculous gifts was actually a worldly method, using otherworldly weapons, spiritual warfare and all that. But it was still a very worldly, pragmatic approach of, we're going to take power over the culture. It's the power over the culture, which is a very worldly thing. And so he went to these otherworldly extremes in some ways of doing a very worldly goal of taking power over the culture, which led to, at the very end of his life, right before he died just before Donald Trump was elected in 2016, Wagner endorsed Donald Trump. And what I'm saying is that wasn't like a break from his life. That was actually very consistent with, I'm going to use whatever weapons are at my disposal to build the kingdom of God by taking power over the culture. And in his view, it wasn't nearly as dark, I don't think, as a lot of his disciples and people who use his stuff. But I think that was his failing. Yeah. I'm just going to, that's my framework.
No, I think you're right about that. I also think this is weird, Pat, because I think we've talked about this dealing with other issues, but I mean, like, I think we're all a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And you're this and you're this. Mm-hmm. And I do think he was a pragmatist. And I do think that that's what I wasn't drawn to before even the gifts of the Spirit came in, that using these, what you call worldly methods to make the machine grow. I also think, I don't know him. So, and I hope it's not just giving him the benefit. I think he was an idealist too. I think it was like when the gifts of the Spirit, when he saw it legitimately happening in these MC 510, that was the class code of the signs and wonders thing that he and Wimber did. I think there was something in him that honestly said, Wow. And because that was not just strategy. Now, he gave some structure to that whole thing Wimber was doing, the signs and wonders thing. But I think there was an idealism and a hunger even in him for God.
Right.
But I agree with what you said too, because I think there's a mixture there. I think this is just something we all need to be aware of.
Well, our friend Ned, you have a mutual friend, Ned, who is my mentor, still is, for 20 some years. And the phrase he always uses is, we're all a mixture of giftedness and dysfunction.
Right.
And once you realize that about people, it helps to get through life,
And it's good that you know that about yourself.
Right.
Be a little more humble about how sure you are about whatever it is you're sure of.
Right.
Well, anyway.
Yeah. So do you want to say some more about just sort of the nuts and bolts of how Wagner went from point A to point B? Or do you want to get into the
a little bit.
The NAR?
I'm really intrigued because in real time, I have memories of I remember it was early days of Open Door, the early 80s when I was at Open Door. So I'm still wearing suits and ties when, like it just dates it for me. And I had a hunger. I talked about this in the last podcast. I had a hunger for being part of a church that in 10 years we would look back and go, no, it wasn't that we pulled all the right levers. There's nothing wrong with that. But that we would be part of something that at the end of the day, we would all go, God did that. Like there was a breath of God was on that thing. And it was more than, yes, God uses you and uses me and our abilities and blah, blah, blah. But that supernatural, I had a hunger for that. But I was totally put off and not okay with most of what I saw, particularly on TV relative to charismatic expressions. It was Jimmy Swaggart. It was, my dad used to say that the whole charismatic thing at the time was a mile wide and an inch deep. I'm sure you've heard that before. And I was just like, oh man, I just couldn't buy it at all. But all of a sudden there was this wind, as it were, coming out of California. And we talked about it this way. A bunch of young guys in my church. We were a couple of the elders. Let's say we were in early 30s by this time and thinking, man, let's check this out. I would not go to any Signs and Wonders conference anywhere that was led by Jimmy Swaggart or somebody I thought, Benny Hinn or whatever.
Right.
But I was interested in this thing coming out of Fuller Seminary. Had some credibility. Peter Wagner's name was attached. John Wimber, and I loved Wimber. We went to a Kansas City Signs and Wonders conference. Jeff Van Vonderen came with me. There was a couple of other elders at the time who were at Open Door, and we all kind of went there as a group. And here's John Wimber, California cool. He's kind of this old surfer dude and kind of a grandpa, not really, but just very great storyteller, really funny, and a really good teacher. I mean, he just broke out the text in 1 Corinthians 12. There was no manipulation at all. And he wrecked me. I mean, I think God did some stuff. In fact, they would talk about his Wimber story was that when he first came to faith, he was in a band that eventually became the Righteous Brothers. He wasn't with them at that point. He had already left, but he was kind of in that kind of stratosphere of celebrity and ability. And when he first came to faith, he asked this question. I think he was maybe at Fuller when he started saying this, but this is part of how he tells the story. And it's part of his charm. He said, he would ask his seminary professor, I get all this stuff about the Greek and the Hebrew and all that exegesis stuff, but when are we going to do this stuff? And the prof would say, what stuff? Well, the stuff that's in the Bible, the stuff that Jesus did. When are we going to do the stuff? So in that, there's kind of innocence, if it really happened that way. There's an innocence, there's a curiosity, is there more maybe? And so they started that class. It exploded. People were coming from all over the country they would audit the class if they could. It was packed. People would watch outside. And it was just creating a ripple, enough of a ripple that some of the upper echelon people at Fuller, the academics, were worried about their credibility, because that's part of what, if you're charismatic,
Right.
You just don't have any academic credibility. Like you must not think very much. And so they had some pushback, but eventually Wimber brought that Signs and Wonders thing on the road. That was what I went to in Kansas City. And I would take too much time to tell the whole story, but I was open but resistant, and I was drawn in by his lack of manipulation, his dealing with the text. Come on and look, watch. Just we're going to pray for people, and they called it a clinic, and it turned me around. I remember going to bed at night and just weeping, going, "There's more." And I believed it, and I still believe it.
Right.
But I hate even more than I used to the counterfeits. Talked about that last time. And so, but let me get back to Wagner, and then I'll get back to you. Let me wrap it up. So there's the Wimber piece, and then Wagner just kept going. This morph that he is so good at. And he got involved with Cindy Jacobs. Was that her name?
Yeah. We'll be talking more about her in later
awareness chapters. Of apostolic prophetic stuff. The latter rain was it was residue from that, and the latter rain is that in the last days there will be an outpouring or like a gushing, waterfall of God's Holy Spirit, and that we were going to be part of that. And so Wagner got into that apostolic, and the churches would be governed by apostles and prophets, and that's where Wimber went, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right.
I also think another dividing place was the Toronto blessing, where and that was kind of like the Lakeland thing was worse. We'll get to that in a second.
And another divider with Wimber that Taylor talks about in the book is one of these legs of the stool that we're going to talk about, which is the strategic level spiritual warfare that Jacobs was bringing in. And so, like, when you talk about the three legs, I think that's the one where John Wimber looked at where Wagner was going in some of this stuff, and he said, you're being hubristic. You've got hubris about what you're doing, where you're taking on these spiritual battles, and but anyway, you can talk about all that.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is exactly at least the first major difference where Wimber kind of backed away. It was that strategic spiritual warfare, this perception that there were spiritual hierarchies. And because spiritual warfare for Wimber and me had been like the way believers are demonized, not possessed, but under the influence of, and we can break the power of that and pray for that and do spiritual, but it was individual. And they were, this other group were expanding it to nations and principalities and powers over nations. And I think there's something to that as well. But Wimber was going, there's something that doesn't smell quite right here. And Wagner kept going. I'm oversimplifying it, but Wagner kept going into that. I think it's really sad. I actually, that Wimber and Wagner, who were very good friends, never did reconcile. By the time Wimber died, they hadn't come back around.
Yeah, and the way that I interpret it, I mean, I didn't know them, and I'm just reading this chapter, but the way that I'm interpreting it is that Wimber saw the danger in what Peter Wagner was doing. Because like, to back up a little bit, Peter Wagner met Cindy Jacobs, and then he started to get into all of this strategic spiritual warfare that we're talking about. And to my mind, they're taking a couple of Bible passages, and this is, again, the first leg of this NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. The first leg of the three-leg stool is this strategic level spiritual warfare, where they're looking at, they're imagining, I think, a demonic hierarchy over all of these different countries, and then they're strategically praying against these demons and doing this violent warfare in the heavenlies, through their prayers. And I just get a little creeped out by it, because I don't see a lot of biblical support for that. It's like they're taking a few passages about we're doing battle with principalities and powers and stuff, and they're expanding that out into a way that I just think is unwarranted. And
well, if you go back in your mind, Pat, to that era, do you remember Frank Peretti?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
This
This
present
present
darkness.
darkness.
Yeah.
There was something in the soup,
Right.
of my church. Like people were reading those books like crazy and
Right.
really developing. I mean, that was fiction. I mean, the guy
Right.
even said that he fictionalized his perception of this kind of stuff. And I remember, this is embarrassing, but I do remember walking through with a couple guys walking through certain parts of our church's building and go, okay, we should pray against this. And I have a really dear friend who, of those kinds of things, says, yeah, you can do that. It ain't going to hurt anything. Ain't going to help anything, but go ahead if you want to.
Right.
Anyway.
But yeah, that was like the big shift that he made after he got it. The big shift was first meeting Wimber and then getting into the charismatic gifts, but then really taking it into this direction of that strategic level spiritual warfare, and that's where it really started to become, okay, this is a new thing that he's part of.
And what's weird about that, it's still, some people might still be tracking with that and going, well, that's all true stuff. I mean, there are principalities of powers and over. But this is where, and this was like, oh no, like I got sick to my stomach when I was reading how the dots get connected when you get into that violent language anyway, the rhetoric, but spiritual warfare over hierarchies. Guess where those spiritual demons are? Well, they're the Democrats.
Right.
And so now it's not just that we disagree with policies and disagree with them a lot, maybe. Mm-hmm. No, they're demons, they're pedophiles, they're under blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. And that when that's charged with spiritual, supernatural, what sounds to some like biblical language.
Yeah.
Whoa. Right. But again, you come out of that with certainty. You know who the good guys are. You know who the bad guys are. No, you don't. Maybe you're the bad guy.
Yeah. And I'm just going to you won't see this, Dave, but I'm going to put up on the screen through the magic of editing. I'm going to put up on the screen those three legs of the stool that we're talking about, because what you just said relates to the third leg of the stool. So these are the three legs that Matthew Taylor lays out of the New Apostolic Reformation, the three things that make it the New Apostolic Reformation. The first one is what we were just talking about, the strategic level spiritual warfare. And it's not just believing in this, it's making it the prime focus of what you're doing, and mobilizing people all around the world in this battle. I mean, it's a huge focus. It's not just like a belief in the background. It was front and center, strategic level spiritual warfare. The second one then is what Dave has been talking about for the last 2 weeks, of governance by apostles and prophets. So, church government, ministry government of, and I would say self-appointed prophets and self-appointed apostles. They're appointed by one, they're recognized by one another. But like I said last week, I see it as a spiritual oligarchy, where they're saying, oh, you get to be part of this club because I see something in you. And I think every one of these people, I'm not saying this on behalf of Dave, I'm not saying this on behalf of Matthew Taylor, I'm saying this on behalf of myself. Every one of these people is a fraud. This is what I believe. The ones that are up in that level, that upper, because they all have to be able to see each other and say, well, what this person is doing is abusive, what this person is doing is manipulative, and none of them come out and say that about each other. They're supporting each other. So I reject the entire group. But Peter Wagner was over them. He drew them together. And I think he was, I look at him more charitably, because I think that he was bringing these people together, and he wanted so badly to believe that they had the giftings of God and that this was the movement of God. And I think they saw him coming a mile away, like I said. But I have no respect for any of these people. I'm just going to say that. But that's the governance by apostles and prophets, self-appointed oligarchy. Then the third one, the third leg is what you were just talking about, aggressive political involvement. That's the thing that really, so you take those first two, spiritual warfare, strategic spiritual warfare, and then you've got these apostles and these prophets that are self-appointed, that are saying they speak with the authority of God, and then you bring in aggressive political involvement with a dominionist theology and this seven mountains theology. And that's what makes it super dangerous and gets to what Dave was just saying about how pretty soon, it doesn't take long before you start saying, well, it's the Democrats that are demonic. So why don't you talk about that third part, including like the dominion theology, the dominion theology, and just kind of fill us in on that. And the rest of the book is about this stuff. So.
Yeah. Let me go back to just comment on one thing you said about them being frauds. I think what I have in my head is there are things about this that are fraudulent for sure, but I still keep going to this mixed bag thing because I know I've been around Mike Bickle. I didn't hang around him, but my two girls went to Master's Commission. We went out there. I've been in that church. I've heard him preach. I had lunch with him. And something idealistic about him, sincere about him, something, I can't live there. I didn't have to unpack all that, but I just kind of hold it. But at the end of the day, the damage it's done, it's been brutal. In fact, when you bring up Bickle right now, it's like they were hiding and denying and calling it something else, 17 cases of sexual abuse by him on younger people. It just makes you want to puke.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll put it this way, Dave. I'll put it this way. Put it in the realm of like a college professor who is a brilliant college professor who really knows his stuff. I say his because I'm going to get to the and his knowledge that he's spinning out there is not fraudulent. There's like he might be whatever he's teaching on, but he's using that knowledge to maybe start a movement that's a dangerous movement, or taking advantage of people, young students, sexually or whatever. That's what I mean by fraudulent. The whole character is fraudulent. It doesn't. So I'm putting that in the intellectual realm of giftedness.
Yes, I get it.
I believe people can be spiritually gifted and abuse that stuff, and that's what makes them frauds, not necessarily.
That's a really good clarification. Yeah. Because I think when I think of the book on spiritual abuse, that's what abuse is. It's someone in a position of power, instead of using their power to nurture and nourish people, they use their power to feed themselves in a variety of ways. And sometimes the feeding of themselves is just, I'm the center of attention. I'm the guy everyone comes to, and I like to be needed. And anyway.
Yeah.
What did you ask me about the Lakeland Revival? And dominion theology?
So then that dominion theology, the last two things that we want to talk about is just for you to at least give like a summary of this third leg of the stool, the political involvement, the dominion theology, what they believe, what they're trying to accomplish. And then I do want to talk briefly about the Lakeland, what Taylor calls it in the book, the Lakeland debacle, the Lakeland Revival.
Should I
just
start
an
there?
example of how this stuff can go off the rails.
Okay, it is a really good example of a bad example. Yeah. And I think it's huge. Can I start there?
Yeah, you can start there. Yeah.
Just a brief history of that. It started in 2008. There was a guy who was an apostle, called himself an apostle, Stephen Strand, who apparently had a church. And he was part of Wagner's international coalition of apostles. It's called the ICA. And this Stephen Strand invited a guy named Todd Bentley to come to his church, like a pastor would do, to have a series of meetings. I mean, you've probably done it. I've done it. And what happened was, after a week or so, it was supposed to last a week, a revival of some kind broke out. And this 1 week thing became 4 months of 7 times a week, every day, all day kind of thing. Lots of reports of healings. Tens of thousands of people came. God TV, it's actually called that, God TV. It's a charismatic television network, got wind of it, and all of a sudden now this Lakeland Revival is getting international coverage. They call it the Lakeland outpouring. But Bentley, the guy who had been brought in to do these meetings, turned out to be problematic. He was a caustic guy. a burly guy. He was 32 years old when he was doing this, so he's pretty young. And at 17, he had been convicted of sexual assault that he committed when he was 13 on a younger boy, and I think he ended up going to jail. But you can go, well, how in the world were they? Well, no, this is a redemption story. So when he came to faith, comes to Jesus, all of a sudden his past life becomes a redemption story, which great. I love it. But he hadn't been formed. He didn't actually grow. He had Taylor described his preaching style as an exaggerated style in the pulpit and a violent flair, which is weird. But he literally, I don't know what he meant, except he said that he would literally punch and kick people when he was to heal them. So, right. It was just weird. But all of a sudden, we talked about this last week. When people are hungry, they'll eat anything. So right. If you can punch me, if I get healed, I'll go to this weird thing that doesn't feel right at all. If there's this promise of relief and release, I'm gonna go, and I just go crazy on that. But Stephen Strand, the guy who asked him to come, realizes, there's some things that are getting a lot of attention, but he had a tiger by the tail, and he didn't know how to reel that in, and he needed some help. So he got a hold of Wagner, who he was connected with. And one of the key guys, the first time I think something like that, a Chinese guy, I think. He's one of the apostles in the NAR. He's in the inner circle with Wagner as well, but he was all in on the revival. He was going, yeah, baby, it's good. So Wagner was in this very weird place. And this was a sad story, I think, for Wagner, where he got left with something that I don't think was entirely his fault.
Right.
He tried his best, but and he wasn't the only one who was getting nervous. They were getting nervous. So what they decided to do was a two-step process where they would gather leading apostles together and do a public commissioning and an alignment ceremony. And this was ultimately put on TV, international coverage. Thousands and thousands of people saw this endorsement of this Bentley guy. And the second thing they did was they assigned apostles to this Bentley guy, right, who would hold him accountable. Dude, you got to dial it down. You need to clean up your act. And so that was their two-pronged approach to that. So in June of 2008, there was an international exposure to this commissioning and alignment service where they endorsed this troubled guy. By the end of June, 400,000 people from 100 countries had attended one of these things. And then it blew up. Right. July 9th. So all that endorsement, international coverage in June is blown up in July 9th. ABC's Nightline did an expose and went into the criminal history of this guy, Bentley. And they began to question his practices, and they could not confirm one healing, even though he promised to provide him. In fact, he promised that he could provide proof, and he even ultimately couldn't provide any proof that healings had happened, even though they're claiming that they had. And that just kind of blew things up. In addition to that, things that I'm sure some people knew about, but they were covering, he had a real significant drinking problem. He'd been drinking during some of these revival meetings. He had an affair with his nanny and ended up divorcing his wife. Okay. Yeah. Whatever. Okay. Character matters. I think I told you, and that's where Wagner got in trouble, because he's out there having endorsed him in this commissioning thing. But there was another rift that I kind of caught up. I just read it again before we went on. That Taylor points out that there was this other subtle thing going on in the NAR, because some of the apostles' prophets were thinking full speed ahead. We just got to keep going at all cost. This is, right. And let's put the best possible memorials on it, though I'm not sure they were. Okay. We need to win the world. This people are getting healed at these things. And there was another group in that NAR that were going, you know what? No, I think we have more confidence in slow and steady growth over time.
Right.
Because that's sustainable. And that became a pretty significant division. And what ultimately happened was that when it finally did blow, Wagner was kind of left with this mess.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that Taylor's going to go into more detail in further chapters. Maybe you even know.
Yeah. Yeah, but what I saw of Wagner in this chapter of how he handled it is an example of what I mean by he was, I think, naive. I think he was very gifted at bringing people together. He was good at recognizing, like, oh, this is a rainmaker. You know, I'm going to bring this rainmaker into this ministry, but he was not gifted at managing, you know, this. You know, he brought in a lot of people who I think were inherently unmanageable. And the mistake he made in this case was that he had all these private reservations that, you know, that he shared privately about Bentley, but publicly he said, I see the hand of God on him and all this stuff. So that was a real failure on his part. That, you know, he publicly endorsed him, even though he had these private reservations.
And what you're touching there, and Taylor touches this pretty significantly as well, is really a horrible blind spot, not just of Wagner's, but I've seen this, and so have you, Pat, in churches where we so like our church is growing, our pastor's great, he's drawing crowds, and then there's this thing over here, but man, he's filling the seats.
Right, exactly.
And I compare that to me, I remember coming across this. We were going through somewhere in the Old Testament, Judges, the book of Judges, and I did the life of story of Samson. And Samson just became to me, because I've always been troubled. There's guys I would know in the ministry, and I know them well enough to know the guys that controlling, he's not a good person. His church is growing. How does that work? Where's God in that? And Samson became this example. And I think Samson is an example of this Bentley guy. And it's really a sin in the church. Samson, without going into all the details, I think I'm assuming people here know the story well enough that God had invested him in incredible gifts for the purpose of setting. They had been, the Israelites, the Jews had been in bondage to the Philistines for 40 years. So that's not a new thing. They were in Egypt like that. So God is looking for another Moses. And he says, okay, I'm going to invest in Samson, whose mother was barren. So there's a kind of supernatural birth attending this thing. There's some really significant mojo on this guy. And his anointing, Pat, was physical strength. And he would vanquish the Philistines. And to me, that's kind of a metaphor of vanquishing the enemies of God to set the people of God free. And when I talk to pastors about this kind of thing, I go, listen, you guys, if God has given you a gift, he didn't give it to you for you.
Right.
If you have one, he gave it to you for them, to set them free. But the real story of Samson, and this is where it's a warning, I think, is that he took this Nazirite vow, and it's weird. Don't touch your hair, don't touch a dead, whatever. But it's symbolic of a guy who was being used by God. It would say over and over in the story of Samson that the Spirit of the Spirit of the Lord would legitimately come on him. He wasn't doing smart. He wasn't a fraud, at least. And when I say fraud, when I hear fraud, like you said at first, and you clarified it well, I hear fake. It's all fake. No, this is very disturbing. The Spirit of the Lord came on him. It really was God who did the stuff through Samson that vanquished the Philistines over and over again. And every time it would give the people a little bit more freedom. But his pattern was to break a vow and, oh no, I broke the vow. Now it's over. And now the Spirit of the Lord would come on him and he would do it again. And he'd break another vow. And then the Spirit of the Lord would come on him and he'd do this positive thing again. And I'm telling you, when you read that old story that sounds so bizarre because he's killing all the Philistines, and when you connect the dots, you go, this happens all the time. This happens all the time. A man or a woman who has an authentic gift from God for the people of God. This is the way I say it. If you have any kind of anointing at all, there's a weight to it. It's heavy. And if you don't have the internal character, strength to carry the weight of it, you're not in it for long.
Yeah.
And what I think happens to people, and they don't mean this when they're starting out, but if you break your vow, and that's symbolic of like, I don't have any kind of interior life. I just kind of do what I want. Remember, there was a woman from Timnah, and she looked good to me. Get her for me. He said that to Samuel or some prophet.
I don't remember, but yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The guy
somewhere it says.
Major impulse control problem. Okay.
Right.
No character. He did not have the carry to carry the weight. But what it did is if you break your vow, don't have an authentic life with God on the inside, it leads you to believe that it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there it is. I mean, I still fill the room. Mm-hmm. I'm still, and your elders will go, I know that about this, about that, but look at all these people who are coming. Yeah. And you're toast now.
I have a story about that.
Go.
I'll just share quickly. The first time that I mean, a couple of times in my life before I was actually a pastor, I spoke publicly, where one time it was at a marriage encounter thing that my wife and I were leading, where I spoke and I felt like a certain kind of power come over my words, where it wasn't me. I mean, I knew what I was saying, but I felt something different, and people responded in a certain way. And after that happened, I went outside and I went on a walk because I was just kind of shaken by that. Mm. And then the same thing happened at Bethel Seminary when I got up in the chapel once. I was asked to speak about something, and I spoke, and I felt this power of the Spirit. The words, I could see the response in the people, and I felt it, and it was something that was way beyond myself. And the chapel, what's that?
You knew it. It was beyond you.
I knew it.
This was not just a talk.
And my response to your point here is when I experienced that, the chapel wasn't even over yet, but I was done speaking, and I walked directly out. I got out of there. I fled because it was like I was kind of overcome by, I don't know how to deal with this. I was in awe of what had just happened. I knew it wasn't about me. And I didn't want to be there to talk to people about it afterwards. I wanted to just, because I was learning how to deal with the fact that God is working through me.
Yeah.
It took some time. It took some time to learn how to even deal with that. And I think some of these people, and I'm not trying to glorify myself by saying this, I'm just trying to share honestly, that was my process. Then as a pastor, it took me some years to even get comfortable hanging around and talking to people after the service, because I was learning to deal with the fact that this is God that did this. It's just, you know what I mean? There's just there's something
Pat,
about that.
I know you well enough to know you're not all that humble. but no, I'm teasing you.
Right.
Because what you just described is true humility.
Right.
I think that is. And that,
yeah.
And
but it was involuntary. It was frightening. It was frightening to feel God work in that way. You know what I mean? And I'm saying, if you lose that, I think if you lose that as somebody who's operating in any kind of spiritual gift, if you lose that sense of awe,
I was going to use the word reverence. Yes.
Reverence. That's when it starts to be dangerous.
I just pointed like I'm now being the preacher guy. Remember? I think that's part of recognizing the gift does not belong to me.
Right.
If it goes through me, I'm blown away. Right. I remember always being, and people wouldn't believe it. My friends that I trusted, I would say it to, but because they just see you up front. But I found myself surprised. when God would move.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an idiot.
Right.
Now I'm not an idiot, and neither are you, but
Right.
I know what you're talking about. There's something else.
Right.
And sometimes you can tell it's happening.
Right. And I think
But
some
if you take
people,
that to yourself.
Yeah, I think some people experience that and they say, I want to harness this.
Yep.
And I want to use it for, and it might even start like, I'm going to use it for these great ends. But if you're not just incredibly careful with it, it turns into what we're reading about in this book.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
So, I did bring up that third leg of the stool, but I feel like this is a good place to kind of wrap this up, actually, because it's like the third leg of that stool is, like I said, the aggressive political involvement. And that's what led eventually, the dominionism and stuff like that. But we're going to get into that. These later chapters are all about this. So we've mentioned the dominion theology, and I feel like this is a good place to stop because it's basically, I would say, Peter Wagner is one of these people who had really good intentions. I don't doubt his intentions at all. And I think he got something rolling that he didn't quite know how to handle.
I agree.
But that through line in his ministry, in my way of thinking about it, was always trying to figure out, I think he viewed the kingdom of God as a power over type thing, where we're going to take power over the culture. We're taking power over the principalities, over the demonic realm, and we're going to take power over the culture. And that's why he looked at Donald Trump just before he died. He died in October. He did his absentee ballot for Donald Trump in 2016 and then died. And I think, to me, that's tragic, but it's consistent with the through line where it's like, this is a guy who's going to help with this power over thing.
And that makes more sense if I could just briefly define the dominion theology.
Yeah.
It's the 7 mountain mandate.
Yeah.
And it's 7 areas of culture, American culture, like politics, business, education, whatever. And that Christians would take dominion over those. It comes out of Genesis 1, and they give dominion over the earth. But it ultimately becomes a power over thing. You're right. And
and that's the through line through all of this book.
Yep.
And so each of the chapters that come we're going to be unpacking that and seeing how it plays out. And it ends up with people storming the Capitol. And now these people are in power again. So,
well, I'm looking forward to talking about that, because one of the things about Wagner's kind of going along with it near the end, it wasn't just, I'm okay with power over. I think if he thought, I wonder if even you kind of confronted that, he would go, no, I don't know. But part of this whole apostolic thing gave room for a guy like Lance Wallnau.
Right, chapter 5.
Who was a businessman, charismatic, who decided, or people told him he was a prophet or an apostle, had a dream. And that's where the whole thing came.
Right.
About Donald Trump being a modern day King Cyrus.
Right.
And I remember when I first heard that, I thought, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard in my wow, there's no biblical scholar I know who would say that stupid stuff.
Right.
And all of a sudden Taylor's going, this is where it came from. It came from this apostolic, if you get a dream, and it was something about Isaiah 43, was he the 43rd president? He must be the 43rd.
He was the 45th president. Yeah. Right.
It goes back to the charismatic stuff we talked about last time, where the weirder it is, the more it's proof it must be God.
Yeah. Well, honestly, like, not the charismatic thing that you just mentioned, but these people, this expression of it, to me, it's not much different from numerology and voodoo. Numerology and voodoo is kind of a lot of what I'm seeing mixed in here.
I know.
So anyway, so given all of that, that's going to leave us here where we're going to look, next week, we're going to start getting deeper into some of the people in this movement and how this dominionism and the 7 mountain mandate and all this kind of stuff factors into all of this. And so any last things you want to say, Dave?
Hugs and kisses.
All right. And you're going to go on vacation here. So have fun.
I'm leaving tomorrow for Arizona, and some of it's going to be fooling around, but I'm also going out to a church, Hope Covenant Church in Chandler, Arizona. I've been there several years in a row. I love the pastor and his wife. Bonnie and I are going to stay there. So we're going to be doing some ministry stuff, doing a retreat out there, but also I'm going to preseason Cubs games.
Oh, nice.
You know, in Minnesota, I have a great Minnesota joke.
Okay.
But in Minnesota, there are no signs of spring. I was like, it got nice yesterday. So, but we had that below zero stuff for quite a while.
Right.
And the sure sign of spring from Minnesotan has nothing to do with the change in the weather. It's when the pitchers and catchers report to spring training. It's coming. It's like, right. it's like a promise of hope.
Right. Yep. And that's what we're all living right now.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, okay. So, all right. So we'll talk to you next week. And thanks everybody for listening. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.